Um, Nimi, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about class considerations and your thoughts on whether there are any class specific considerations for cell and gene therapy products that both industry and regulators can collectively think about to drive policy development.
Hi, Aaron. Yes, that's a great question, and I do think there are class considerations, and not stating something innovative. They've been considered by FDA themselves. They've issued a guidance, on CAR T products as a class. They've issued guidance on genome editing products as a class. They've issued guidance on gene therapy for hemophilia products, which could be considered a kind of product class. In their long-term follow-up guidance from the agency, there are class considerations. There's a whole table on the different kinds of products, and like Bob alluded to, the 15-year follow-up recommended for editing products versus 5-year follow-up recommended for AAV-based products. However, in practice, we've seen that the 15-year follow-up is typically followed. So in nutshell, yes, are there class-specific considerations? Yes. And so it would be helpful to develop policy around those to clarify class-specific considerations. I mentioned earlier, in response to a question related to CMC, there may be class-specific established conditions, for examples, for AAV-based products or what have you. And then updating the guidance for those class considerations, for example, like I mentioned, long-term follow-up guidance, the final guidance may need some updates because we've seen some changes in practice from what the guidance articulates for AAV-based products based on, data that came to surface since that guidance was finalized. Similarly, for gene therapy, for hemophilia guidance, that talks about use of surrogate endpoints versus clinical endpoints and how those have come out in practice and some benefits to updating those guidance. And there are other possible policy considerations for class effects, as an example, labeling statements for systemically administered liver-directed AAV-based gene therapies as a class, or CAR T products as a class, and honing in more on that example, maybe class labeling considerations for malignancy risk. Now, if you look across FDA-approved SBAs, summary basis of approvals, or labels across product classes, it does shed light on some common terminology related to malignancy risk as labeled for these products. There is really no consensus or shared learnings yet consolidated by industry or by FDA for a common understanding of how these could apply as product classes. And there's also some consistency and some lack of consistency in how these statements come across in labels. For example, if you look or conduct an overview of FDA-approved labels for cell therapy products, they show some consistency in somewhat similar language regarding warnings and carcinogenicity considerations. However, if you look at AAV-based systemically administered liver-directed gene therapy products, some products have such statements, some don't. Without any causal data for any of these products to malignancy, they're labeled as theoretical concerns when labeled or not labeled at all. So it seems like the approach taken is when there was a case and it was followed up, there is some kind of theoretical risk label put in the label, or when there was no risk, or if a product was a shorter clinical trial or smaller patient database and there is no such observation in the clinical trial stage, there is no theoretical risk labeled as well. So I feel like this is one example. There are also other examples, but overall it would be helpful to the field, including for both developers and regulators, to understand class effects and class considerations and how they are presented in FDA-approved labeling, which in turn will facilitate better interpretation and understanding of approved labeling by patients, caregivers, end users, healthcare professionals, as well as payers. And also there may be concerns to not unnecessarily alarm patients for claims that may not have established evidence or reasonable evidence. And FDA has taken this class approach for labeling statements in the past. For example, warning for mad cow disease is a class labeled warning for all hemophilia products, whether or not there is any evidence or case in a given product, and that's one example. So in summary, there could be some consideration for standard boilerplate language for a class of products in the cell and gene therapy space, whether or not there is causal data, or alternatively, there could be a policy for a class to not label any statement for theoretical risks which are not substantiated or there is no causal data.